there's a need to criticize. But the art of criticism is something very serious in Judaism, as we will see in a moment. So a lot of people look at criticism as constructive criticism. They like to say, I'm criticizing you because I'm just actually going to give you constructive criticism. And most of the time, it doesn't even work. The famous story with a patient that comes into a doctor, and the doctor is complaining that he's not feeling well, and the doctor says, well, your cholesterol is high, and your lungs are not good, and you got to give up. How much do you smoke? He says 3 packs a day. What is your diet? I eat fatty foods and fries all day. And how much do you exercise? Me exercise. I'm a couch potato. So finally says, okay, you're not going to be able to live this way, and prescribes a whole way of life. And then when it comes to pay the bill, the patient doesn't want to pay the bill. And he says, why? He says, I'm not going to follow your advice anyways. So, sometimes you have constructive criticism and it falls by the wayside. So we're going to try to examine that. But mainly the focus of tonight is, how do we effectively influence other people in a positive way? Now, another thing that's necessary to preface with this class is, we're not talking about a situation where the relationship deteriorated to the point where the couple is not talking or the friends are not behaving nice to each other. We're not talking about a case where there was a major violation of trust. In those situations, one needs to, appeal to proper therapy to be able to get the help that they need. So we're talking about where there is a healthy relationship, but in the healthy relationship, there could be times where one partner or spouse annoys the other one. And because of the annoyance, they feel like they have to tell them about the annoyance and set it right. And that's the question, how do we do that, right? So if you're going to look up on the board, it's going to show you difficult conversations. Let's say you have a situation where one of the spouses spends too much time on the phone and the other spouse is irritated with it. So at night, when they both come home from work, each one of them is on the phone and doesn't pay attention to the other one, or doesn't pay attention to the needs of the house. So it's a difficult conversation. How do you have that conversation? What happens if you have a teenager who is failing academically and you want to set them right? You know that they have the ability, they have the smarts to be able to succeed, but either they're lazy or they have some other issues and you want to talk to them. How do you talk to them about it? A friend has said some insensitive things to you. So how do you deal with that? What happens if you live in a neighborhood that everybody's yard is prim and proper, and there's one neighbor right next to you that they never cut the grass, and they actually keep a messy place, and that's the result. Mosquitoes come, and there's all kinds of stuff that is a problem. How do you deal with that, right? Or if you have a coworker who's consistently late or underperforming, and it affects everybody. So how do you deal with that? So again, to reiterate for those that missed the opening, I'll be very, very brief, because the opening is the most important. It sets the tone for the rest of the evening. So it's very, very important. Until now, what we've talked about is basically how to focus on the positive, how to be able to see the positive and not to see the negative in everything. What we're talking about here is where there's a situation where we need to influence people because there's a need to criticize. How do you criticize according to the Torah? And as I mentioned before, people say that it's constructive criticism, but usually constructive criticism has no effect whatsoever. So the question is, how do we deal with that? Or is there a need to criticize? So we're going to start with something very interesting. If you give a look, in the text, page 197, give a look, text 1. This is taken from the Talmud, the Tractate of Erchin, Says Rabbi Tarfon. Rabbi Tarfon was one of the Tanaim that lived at the times of Rabbi Akiva. So Rabbi Tarfon exclaimed, I wonder if there's anyone in this generation who knows how to accept critique. If one person tells another, remove the sliver from between your teeth, the second retorts, remove the beam from between your eyes. So what's the meaning of that? Generally, when we criticize someone, even if we mean well, the person puts up their defense. So they react defensively. And when they react defensively, what happens? They come out with a harsher criticism. Who are you? And the idea of the sliver versus the beam is also explained by one of the commentaries, that there was beams lying around which didn't belong to the people that picked it up. And one person took the beam, and as he was banging up the beam to use it for his house, there were pieces that fell off like splinters. So another person grabbed the splinters. And one day, the guy that had the beam said to him, these splinters, they're not even yours. You stole them. Go return them. So he says, who are you to speak? I just have splinters. You have the beam that you stole. So sometimes when it comes to criticism, when somebody says to us, why are you doing this, that, and the other? Says, look who's talking. Your faults are worse than mine. So that is where Rabbi Tarfon is saying that nobody knows how to take criticism. So Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah actually commented, and he said, it ain't so. It might not be the problem of accepting the criticism. I wonder if there's anyone in this generation who knows how to properly provide critique. So what is this meaning? Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says perhaps the reason why nobody can take criticism is because we live in a generation where people are very judgmental and people are just self-centered. So therefore, the criticism that they give is just to satisfy themselves, as we're going to see in tonight's lesson, that it depends where the criticism comes from. So what we're going to do is do a little study on how to give criticism, what the faults of criticism are, when is a time to give criticism, and when not. So the primary question that we might ask is, why in the first place should we criticize? Isn't it better that we should just hold our mouths shut? And if we see somebody doing something wrong, we are quiet. You grind your teeth and let them be, and let's be quiet. And in the West, most people say that that's the right thing to do. Live and let live. Don't agonize over someone else's behavior. It's not yours, and let them be. It's their own problem. If they want to crash into a wall with their behavior, let's just watch it. Why should we even do it? Unless they offend us. You know, there's the story with the Jewish fellow that was in a pond, and he was with a wave and he couldn't get out. And there were two Russian policemen, and he started to yell, save me, I'm drowning. They came running and they saw it was a Jew. They couldn't care less. They say, drown. That's none of our business. And finally he says, down with the government, the Tsar is terrible. Oh, they jumped in and they grabbed him out, because now they have to arrest him for incitement. So in other words, sometimes in the West, we do criticize if we feel we got to teach the person a lesson and take care of them. So it's interesting that the Torah has a very powerful statement in Leviticus. And it's a very potent statement. Let's give a look in text 2 on page 198. The Torah in Leviticus says the following: do not hate your brother in your heart. You shall surely reprove your fellow. By the way, the English reprove here instead of rebuke, which most is rebuke, has a little story why the JLI used it. Jonathan Sacks, the former chief rabbi from England, wrote his PhD in the 80s when he received his doctorate, and it had to do with how to rebuke people in a positive way. And he wrote this whole thing about rebuke. And he sent it into the Rebbe, because he was a student of the Rebbe. And the Rebbe wrote him back and he said, I would prefer if you change the English translation from rebuke to reprove, because rebuke can also mean reject. And we don't reject anyone. So when we are criticizing someone or admonishing someone, It's not for the point of rejecting them. It's for the point of bringing them back into the fold. So it was changed to reprove. So that's why the JLI uses the reprove. So what do we see here? We're soon going to get back to the fact that it says, do not hate your brother in your heart. Most commentaries explain that you shouldn't bear a grudge against someone quietly. If there's something bothering you about someone, find the proper time to sit down and clear the air. But to walk around with that grudge is a prohibition in the Torah, because it leads to terrible things. And a lot of times it can be just a misunderstanding. A lot of times it could be something that happened that was unintentional, or something that we didn't even understand what took place. So that's how they interpret, do not hate your brother in your heart. But the second part of the pasuk, which says, Hocheach tochiach, you shall surely, and the reason it says it twice, Hocheach tochiach, you shall surely reprove your fellow, means to say that we have an obligation to reprove and to criticize or set someone straight. This has become a very big issue. Rabbi Shneir Zalman of Liadi addresses it in his famous book, the Tanya, when he speaks about love your fellow as yourself. And he tells the story of Hillel, that when Hillel was approached by the Gentile who wanted to convert to Judaism, he said, this that is spiteful to you, don't do to your friend. The rest is commentary. So the Alter Rebbe says that for that reason, we shouldn't be judgmental of other people. We are all brothers and sisters. We should love each other. And even if we see someone doing something wrong, it's not our place to put them down. But then he says, you'll ask me the question that you have to reprove your fellow. First of all, it has to be your fellow, someone that you're very close to, someone that you're so comfortable with that if you reprove them, they won't feel uncomfortable with it. And secondly, you have to actually meditate on what you're going to say to them. That's why Hillel said it in the negative. This that you don't like to be done to yourself, don't do to others. Put yourself in his shoes. How will you take the criticism before you criticize them? And we're going to develop this idea a little bit more later. But the idea of setting someone straight and to criticize them seems to be a mitzvah. Now, why is that a mitzvah? So in the Western world, Western culture, the simple thing is it's not my place to reprove others. We don't have a right. You know, when you talk about law and order, that's the government's job. But it's not our job to tell people how to behave or not. Why? Because the source of our goal in life is that we should be able to self-preserve and survive. It comes from what we call the nefesh habahamit, the animal soul. And the animal soul, all it cares about is self-preservation and survival. And if this puts me into a difficult situation with someone, and it makes my self-survival, it challenges my self-survival, why should I get involved in it? Why should I even do it? Because if I'm going to criticize the person, it's definitely going to be seen as a negative. The person will become defensive and criticize me. So what do I need it for? However, from the Torah perspective, it flows from the godly soul. The godly soul is mission-oriented, and it's totally selfless. It's not about me. It's about the mission. And when it comes to the mission, the only way the mission can succeed is if everybody is on board. Take, for instance, the Rebbe once used the example of an astronauts on a spaceship. So if one day while they're on their mission and they're out in outer space, one of the astronauts says, you know, I'm not going to abide by the rules and I'm going to do something else. It could torpedo the entire mission. And you don't even have to go to outer space. I was speaking to somebody here in Charlotte that used to serve in the special forces of the Israeli military. And it was something like the Navy SEALs. It was called Sayeret Matkal. And they used to have 6 people in a team. And he said the team had a captain and everyone had their particular mission that they had to do themselves and together. And it was, the tension was so tight that if one person deviated even one hair, the whole mission would sink and they would all lose their lives. So when you look at the spiritual aspect, you see that we were all created to serve God. Everything that we do is in the service of Hashem. So if someone is not doing their part, it affects not only us, it affects the whole universe. So therefore, we have the obligation to set them right for the sake of the mission. However, even if we do that, we have to be effective, and we have to do it in a correct way. So just because the Torah says that we have to give criticism or we have to admonish, doesn't give us a free license to do whatever we want. In fact, the Torah gives us a very specific guidelines which way you can do it, and in some cases it's better not to do it because it's going to actually cause more harm. So we're now going to explore how it's done. But just to give you a little bit of a take of what we're going to take, the overview. Number one is guiding with love, which we're going to talk about. What does it mean to criticize out of love? Not to criticize, but to admonish out of love. The second thing will be guiding with sensitivity, gentleness. The word is really sensitivity, to be sensitive and gentle. The third one is the guide with humility. And the fourth is the guide with positivity. So now that we've put forth the question and we've put forth the issue, we're actually going to take a little journey of some parts of history of the Torah, which will give us great insights in how we do that. So first, we're going to give you a little bit of history from biblical history. But we're going to start with the second one, not with the first. So if you look at the right side, you will see Moshe, who's the leader of the Jewish people. If you look at the left side, you see Bilam. Okay? Who was Bilam? Bilam was the Gentile prophet hired by Balak to curse the Jews, because Balak, the king of Moab, was afraid of the power of Moses, and he knew that all the wars Moses was victorious. So he asked, what's the power of Moses? The power is a prophet. We'll get a prophet from the Baal who will do the same work as Moshe, and he will be the counterbalance to Moshe, and perhaps through that, the Jewish people will be destroyed. What was the result? The result was that God said, you can only give blessings. What is quite interesting is that the most beautiful, poetic, messianic, Kabbalistic blessings describing the Jewish people came from the words of Bilam. One very interesting one that everybody knows is a verse that we say in the morning davening, Matovu ahalecha Yaakov mishkanotecha Yisrael. How good are your tents, Jacob, your dwelling places, Israel. Speaking about the symmetry, speaking about the modesty, the lack of jealousy. It goes on further and further. It speaks about the greatness of the Jewish people. So many of the blessings and the predictions of what will be in the future of Israel is actually found in this in the writings of Bilam. Moses, on the other hand, as much as he did good for the Jewish people, but before he passed away, in his last will and testament, he gave a very strong speech of admonition to the Jewish people, speaking of the terrible punishment that will befall them if they stray from God. So the question is asked, wouldn't it have been better that Moshe, who loved the Jews, should give all the blessings, and Bilam, who hates the Jews, he should give all the curses? And you see the reverse. So the Medrash addresses it. If you give a look on page 200, text 3. The Medrash asks a question. Would it not have been more appropriate to critique to emerge from the mouth of Bilam and the blessing from the mouth of Moses? What is the answer? However, if Bilam had provided critique, the Jewish people would have dismissed it, claiming the person who hates us is critiquing us. He's just an anti-Semite. What is the anti-Semite going to say? Of course, he's going to say negative about us. It happens today also. If anyone gets up to criticize us, we immediately dismiss them as an anti-Semite, right? So therefore, it would be non-productive. So when you have that the anti-Semite is giving the blessings, that's something which is worthy listening to. Then it means it's genuine because he really hates us. So when he's singing our praise, you know that his praise is real. Moshe, on the other hand, loved the Jewish people. So if he would have offered the blessings, other nations would have downplayed it, arguing the person who loves them is blessing them. God therefore declared, let Moses, who loves them, offer them criticism, and let Bilam, who hates them, provide them with blessing. So what is the lesson that we take from this? This is about love. Remember, the first thing that we talked about is how to admonish with love. The idea is that when you give admonition, it has to come from someone that truly loves the person, not from someone that has a grudge against the other person. Because if you have a grudge against the other person, it would be non-effective. And then secondly, you're satisfying your animal soul. But if you truly love them, then you're not coming from the animal soul, you're coming from a selfless place. So then it's very, very good. The previous Rebbe actually says something very interesting. Remember the verse that we read before, do not hate your brother in your heart, and you should surely reprove your fellow. So this is what he says about this. The Torah prefaces the directive, you shall surely reprove your fellow with the instruction, do not hate your brother in your heart. This informs us that before we criticize someone, we must first eliminate from ourselves anything that bears the mark of agitation, so that while we provide critique, we're free of any feeling other than love. Only on the heels of this effort can our critique be effective. This is a very powerful statement. The previous Rebbe actually wrote a letter in 1932 from Europe to a newspaper editor in Canada. It was in Winnipeg, Canada, because he had said something. He wrote a letter to the Jews in Winnipeg. There was a big Hasidic community there. So the editor thought it would be funny, and he wrote that the previous Rebbe writes a letter to the cold country of Canada. Now, in the Hasidic vernacular, when you say someone is cold means they're apathetic. Warm means they're passionate. So could be some people could have interpreted that the previous Rebbe was saying that the Jews in Canada are not only living in a cold environment, but they're apathetic, and he didn't believe so. So when he wrote the letter to the editor, he first said, I'm coming out of love to you. I love you, and I'm saying it just in a way because I also love the people that live in Winnipeg, so they shouldn't think that I was critical of them. However, we have to recognize that that's not enough. Believe me, that's a very big move. Truth to be known, most of us, when we criticize and we feel self-justified in doing that, we don't examine ourselves to see if we truly love the person or not. We might be very annoyed by the person, but we're so justified because they did wrong, so therefore we're criticizing them. Comes along the pasuk and says, you don't have the right to criticize if you have an ounce of animosity towards the person. If you carry a grudge or anything that you don't see the person in a positive light, you have no right to criticize them. It's a no-no. You first have to remove that. But then we learned that that's not enough. Why is that not enough? Because not having animosity to them still will not effectuate them. And that is where we see the difference between Noah and Abraham. Somebody sent me 2 weeks ago a little video snippet I would have shown here, but it was in Yiddish, and I don't know how many people follow Yiddish. And it was in a Jerusalem soup kitchen where you have poor people that are eating, and it's cold, and they're eating hot soup, and there's just a lot of good feeling there. So one of the people who unfortunately is in that state that he has to rely on the soup kitchen, but he's quite a learned person. So he says, Noah, according to the Midrash, which Rashi brings down, built his ark in how many years? How long did it take him to build his ark? According to
20 years?
120 years. Why did it take him so long according to the Midrash? Because God wanted him to create a paradigm shift in society. He lived in a very evil place where people were very selfish and they were cruel. And here he's building an ark. He's building an ark not at the riverbanks or at the sea. He's building it in the middle of his driveway. And not only that, he's building it as a huge, it was how many football fields big? It was huge. And why is he building the ark? So he engaged with people in conversation to say that God is going to punish the world and he's going to flood the world. How many people actually heeded him? Zero. Zero. Proof to that is because when the Torah describes who were the people that actually entered into the ark, it was only Noah and his family, nobody else, and the animals that they chose, but nobody else. So after 120 years of banging nails and doing carpentry work, although he had no negative feeling towards the people, he was totally ineffective. His batting average was 0. Comes along Abraham, who was a great-great-grandson 10 generations removed. And it says that when he moved from Haran to the promised land, to the land of Canaan, which eventually became the land of Israel, he had thousands of people coming with him. As the Pasuk, as the Torah says, Es hanefesh asher osu b'choron, the souls that they made in Haran. So it says that as a couple, as a dynamic couple, both Abram and Sarah brought thousands of people to follow God, follow monotheism. Now, how did that happen? It wasn't through banging nails. It was through being kind to them, because Abraham was and Sarah were the epitome of kindness. They fed people. They gave of themselves to people. And when you feed people and you give yourselves to people and you're kind to them, so then you effectuate change in them more than putting up the biggest ark possible. So this again says that it's not enough that we remove animosity from our hearts before we criticize, but we also have to fill ourselves with love. Now, this is a very tall order. So even though it says criticize, you shall criticize, or that you should rebuke, or we don't want to use the word rebuke, we want to use the word reprove, there's conditions to it. And the conditions is a long way of self-improvement until we get there. And by the way, we will soon see that all four, the love and the sensitivity and the humility and the positivity, are all intertwined with each other. Here's where the Rebbe builds on it. Just to give you a little background, the Rebbe could not tolerate when rabbis, he criticized rabbis all the time, when rabbis would use the pulpit to admonish people and to scream at people and to reject people and to say that they're worthless or they're not keeping Torah mitzvahs. He says, you were never given the permission to do that. Your permission was to lift them, to encourage them, to inspire them. And here's one, so here the Rebbe explains the difference between Avram and Noah. So he says in text 5 on page 202, critique extended simply for the sake of observing the Torah's instruction, you shall surely reprove your fellow, even if repeated 100 times. That's what it says. You should do it even 100 times, the Talmud says, will not nearly have the same effect as critique motivated by a sincere desire to bring benefit to the intended recipient. This can explain why Noah's admonition failed to inspire the people to mend their ways, but not so Abraham. Abraham was inspired by his divine soul. He saw himself as an instrument of the divine, because remember, what was his purpose? His purpose was to reveal godliness in the world. As it says, he called on God's name wherever it was. And how did he do so? Not only by himself igniting the fire, passion for God, but igniting it in other people as well. So the reason that he connected with other people is to inspire them that they should also have the love. So this could only come by not only through constructive criticism, but that he truly cared about the person that he was criticizing. So here's a story that I wanted to say. In 1991, there was a famous rabbi in Israel that I'm not going to mention his name, only because the Rebbe went with a different approach, and he followed the path that you have to rebuke people, not reprove, but rebuke people. And I remember one time he was putting his weight behind a political party, and he said, I have a special announcement to make. And the TV media came from all over Israel. And his announcement was that Israel is going to suffer another Holocaust because they don't keep kosher, they don't keep Shabbat, and all kinds of stuff. Well, the Rebbe reacted in a very, very strong way about it. And he said that the prophet says, in the name of God, Amzu Yatzarti, this is the nation that I have formed. These are my children, my people. How can you criticize my people? And the Rebbe went on the other side, and he says, God forbid to ever mention the word Holocaust again, or that people are worthy of a Holocaust. Use the power of positive influence to elevate people and inspire them. However, sometimes if you do need to criticize, there is a way of criticizing. So let's give a look. Text 6. This is taken from the Rebbe's talks of that year. Proverbs teaches us, listen, my child, to the critique of your father. Very famous statement in Hebrew. Shma beni musar avicha, v'al titosh et Torah imecha, which means listen to the critique of your father and do not neglect the teachings of your mother. That's what it says there, right? Those who love their children are diligent to critique them. The verses link critique to a child-parent relationship, thereby informing us that all critique must resemble the redirection parents provide to their children. Parents bear an intrinsic and constant love for their children. Even when they offer verbal criticism and discipline when warranted, their true love for their children is apparent at the same moment. The same is true with the Torah's directive. You shall surely reprove your neighbor. Our words of critique must be suffused with love. The litmus test is if the listener can feel that the message is delivered purely out of love. There is a story in the previous Rebbe's memoirs, which is very touching. And whenever I read the story as a young man, it tore me up. But it's a very important story. There was an elderly couple that they were blessed with a child later in life. And the child was a bright child and learned studiously. And every time he came home, his mom was there to greet him, and his father was working. And she would take care of him, make sure he does his homework and does whatever he has to do. And then she got ill and she passed away. So he became a single parent raising his son, but he couldn't stop working because he had to earn a livelihood. His son was already in elementary school, so he trusted him. He says, when you get home from school, you go home and you do your homework, feed the chickens, they all had animals in the back, and do what you have to do. One day, the father comes home earlier than expected. And to his horror, he sees that his son is in the backyard and he is harassing and torturing the animals, throwing pebbles on them, kicking them, throwing them, and having a grand old time playing with them in a rough way. And being such a sensitive man that he was, he fell apart. And he became so upset that he told his son, you come with me. He sat down with him and he said, you cause pain to others, which is unbecoming. And I never thought that my son would do that. And for that, I'm going to have to cause you pain. And he took off his belt and he sat him down and put him over his knees and he spanked him. Son got up like nothing happened. And then the father went into his bedroom. Son was wondering, what's the father doing in the bedroom? So he peeped through the keyhole and he sees his father on the floor, weeping like a baby, crying and saying, why do I have a son that is not sensitive? how can I allow myself to be fooled that my son is not sensitive? And that crying of his father that the son observed affected him much more than the spanking. It actually changed his whole life. When he saw that his father, who was suffering as a widower and barely making it and raising him, and what was his pain, his behavior, he couldn't take it. And from that day, he became a changed person. So what does it mean? It means to say that when we do it out of love and care, and the recipient feels that it comes from love and care, it can actually penetrate, and we feel the pain as well. There is a video here, and I'm debating whether to show it because it's something that in the olden days was very common. So it's the story of a sauna. There's nothing immodest, don't worry about it. But it's the idea of when is a person allow themselves to be beaten with these, what are they called? They have these eucalyptus branches that when they're in a sauna.
Switch.
Huh?
Beaten with the...
Yeah. So it's sort of like it massages and it gets their blood going. So this is the story that I would like to share with you. It's on the video. Stop it.
Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Schneerson, the sixth Chabad Rebbe, often used anecdotes and examples to convey deep truths. In 1940, after escaping Nazi Europe, he arrived in America and quickly began inspiring a spiritual revival. One of his emissaries was Rabbi Shalom Ber Gordon, who in the summer of 1948 was sent to serve as a rabbi in Newark, New Jersey. Rabbi Gordon knew that to effect change, he would need to guide, correct, and critique. However, he was warned that typical forms of critique would alienate his congregation. Unsure of how to proceed, he sought advice from the Rebbe. To his surprise, the Rebbe asked him if he had ever visited a Russian sauna, or banya. Rabbi Gordon confirmed that he had, and the Rebbe asked him to describe it. Rabbi Gordon explained that in the banya, visitors ascend bleachers to experience increasing levels of steam intensity. After an individual is thoroughly heated, they happily submit to having a besom, branches and leaves moistened in hot water struck repeatedly against their back. The Rebbe then asked his emissary to imagine someone striking a random fellow on the street with the same besom. Certainly, the horrified victim would use all means to fend off their attacker. But why is it that this treatment is welcome in a sauna that would be rejected if done on the street? The answer is that the sauna's atmosphere is one of camaraderie, and its attendees are first warmed up and elevated. In this context, the attendees not only invite besom lashing, but they even plead for more. Critique, when offered randomly, can feel like a sidewalk assault. But critique offered under sauna-similar conditions is not only acceptable but even appreciated. In a sauna relationship, the parties share a strong sense of togetherness. The relationship is very warm, and it undergoes periodic elevations as each party seeks to improve and to enhance their mutual connection. In such an atmosphere, a critique is neither delivered nor received as a critique, but as a loving gesture. The receiving party may even request additional prods of inspiration.
Okay, so a lot of it has to do with the language we use and where it's rooted. And this is what we're going to say. When the criticism comes from the animal soul, it's all about our self-interest. So let's say we're annoyed with someone being on the phone the whole time, which it might be wrong for them to be on the phone, but we're doing it because we're annoyed. It's us. So therefore, when it comes out, it's really our animal soul that's being disturbed. However, when it comes from the godly soul, it doesn't come because we're annoyed. We take the annoyance away. We're doing it because if a person is on their phone the whole time during services, let's say, they're not able to focus. So the minyan, let's say you have 10 people for the minyan, and they all have to answer Amen, and one is on the phone, so then they don't hear the blessings, they won't recite Amen, so the whole minyan is affected, right? This is a sort of example. So you go kindly to them and say, your Amen is so great, and it would be accomplished better if you don't do it with the phone. So it's a different kind of way. They know that they're not doing it for their selfish way. Another thing that we do is what I said before about the story of Hillel. The third Chabad Rebbe, Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, with Tzemach Tzedek, asked the question, why is it that Hillel didn't use the conventional term that's found in the Torah? It says you should love your fellow as you love yourself. And Hillel, when he was asked by the person that wanted to convert to Judaism, what's the essence of Torah? And he says, this that is hateful to you, don't do it to someone else. The rest is commentary. Go study. He should have simply said, love your fellow as much as you love yourself. The rest is commentary. And go study. Why did he use such a roundabout way? And the explanation is that when you say love someone as you love yourself, it doesn't really express it, because it doesn't mean that you put yourself in the other person's shoes. When you say this that is spiteful to you, don't do to someone else. So then you say, okay, if I'm going to approach that person and criticize them, let me do a role reversal. Let me try to imagine that I am the one that is going to be criticized by that friend who's going to come to me. How will I take the criticism? What words would I want that person should use to me to effectuate change and to show that they truly love me? That is a true admonition that comes from love, where the godly soul is there, because it's selfless. It's not for selfish reasons. Because when it comes from selfish reasons, then the criticism is going to come out as a selfish attack. So we have to work on ourselves that it should come from a selfless place and come from love. So that was the first thing. But there is another thing as well. The Talmud says timing is everything. Very interesting statement that's in the Pirkei Avot, the Ethics of Our Fathers. If you look at page 204, text 7, Rab Shimon ben Elazar, Rab Shimon the son of Elazar, says, do not attempt to soothe someone's anger during the time of their wrath. When someone is truly angry, you don't go to them and say, I want to appease you, I'm going to criticize you, or I'm going to find a way. Just let them finish with their anger. And then later, when they calm down, then you can approach them. Or do not attempt to console them at the time when their deceased lies before them. This is actually a halacha. The halacha is that when someone loses a loved one, the mitzvah of condolence or comforting the bereaved does not start yet. And as we learned in the first class, all you can do is listen. That's called empathy. You show them that you're there with them, and you are together in the hole with them, and you understand them, you embrace them, but you don't try to comfort them. The comforting can only be after the burial, when the deceased is no longer in front of them. Not only that, the halacha says the first 3 days, you're not supposed to start the conversation. The mourner is supposed to start the conversation, and then you answer the mourner, because the mourner is grieving so deep that any words that you're going to say can be taken the wrong way and could irritate them. I actually experienced it when I was, after my bar mitzvah, a classmate of ours suddenly lost their father, and we came to comfort them in the first day. And there was one smart aleck in our class that thought that if he's going to make it into a comedy show, he's going to actually help him. So he started saying all these jokes, and the more jokes he was saying, the more the classmate was falling apart in grief, because he didn't want to hear jokes. He didn't want to laugh. He wanted to grieve. He wanted to cry, because he was in a state of such shock about losing his father. So everything is timing. So the same thing is true when you see someone doing something that is not, damaging. It's not like you're saying, if you're going to do this, you're going to kill someone, or if you're going to drive reckless, you're going to cause death. We're talking about someone that did something that needs rebuke. So wait for the right time. Wait for the time that you think that the person is receptive to it. There's an Italian joke of a Italian mobster, and sorry for coming from Brooklyn, we always used to say that. So he was in a firefight with some other gangster, and he was shot in the chest, and he was bleeding, and he could barely breathe. And he runs into his mother's house screaming help. And his mother says, let's go eat first, then I'll talk to you. It's not what he wants, right? So you have to know that when we criticize, sometimes the criticism is not going to be effective. It's actually going to change the person. It's not going to change the person. It's actually going to be worse. So this is what we have in the next slides. I must help them or they need help. What's the difference between the two? I must help them is all about me. About me. There's a story told that there was a Jewish American guy that wasn't religious, and he came to the hotel, and somebody approached him and said, come, let's put on tefillin. And he said, no. And then when he went to the Chabad booth, and the Chabad guy asked him, put on tefillin, he immediately rolled up his sleeve. So he was asked later, why? What was the difference? He said, the first guy that approached me, I saw he was looking for credits for himself. Oh, I did another thing. I got another film. So I was just a tool in his ego. I didn't want to be part of it. But the Chabad guy came, he wasn't thinking about himself. He was thinking about me. He was saying, maybe you have the opportunity to be able to do a mitzvah today, and you might feel great of it, with it. So he felt that it wasn't that I must help them. He was trying to help me, that I should truly experience the wall. I once told you the story that there is a religious group in Jerusalem. They're called the Neturei Karta. I don't know how many of you heard of them. They look very Haredi, but they don't represent all the Haredim. They're very, very extreme. They're totally unaccepting. They're anti-Israel in many ways. And they're the ones, many of them are protesting against going to the army and stuff like that. So they, in 1976, wrote in a magazine a very strong critique of the Rebbe, that the Rebbe's mitzvah campaign was off the mark. Just to stop a Jew and ask them to light candles or to put on tefillin doesn't do it. You got to tell the Jew that they are nothing unless they keep Torah mitzvah. And it was a very strong critique. I knew about it because just as it went off the press, it was actually stolen by a group, and it was reprinted anyways, but they gave me a copy because I was on the way to New York, and they put it in an envelope. They said, give it to your father to bring it into the Rebbe. My father was one of the Rebbe's secretaries. We know you want to read it, so therefore we didn't seal it, but as long as you read it and keep it clean, don't read it when you're going to eat your meal. So I was very, very careful, and I read the article. And I came in on a Thursday night, and the next day was Friday, and Shabbat, the Rebbe addressed it. Nobody in the audience knew about it except my father and me, because we both read it. And the Rebbe said there are two ways of approaching a person. One way is saying, you're evil, you're full of faults, and you're doomed. But follow me, I'll show you how to be saved. Yeah. So if the person is nice to you, he'll say, have a nice day. If he's not nice to you, it might be harsher. Or you can use the Baal Shem Tov's approach and say, you have pearls and treasures buried deep into your soul that you may not even know, I might not even know. Come, let's go explore those treasures. So you're intriguing them. They want to understand what it is. So you're coming to them with a positive way. Same thing as with criticism. When it's criticism with love, you say to them, there's a word in Yiddish, sapasnisht, or in Hebrew, they say zelomatim. What is zelomatim? It's not fitting for you to behave like that. Let's do it a little better. So that kind of criticism comes out better. One other text in this love, and then we're going to go to the gentleness. Text 8. This is very powerful. The Gemara, the Talmud says in the Tractate of Yevamot, just as it's a mitzvah to sheer words that will be accepted, so it's a mitzvah not to deliver words that won't be accepted. So if you know that your words will not be accepted, better be quiet. So before you say the criticism, try to think how it'll be received. And if you feel that the recipient is not going to be moved by that, so if you're just coming from a selfish place that I need to say it, then it doesn't make a difference. But if you really care about the individual, it's a mitzvah not to say it. There's a story with one of the Hasidic Rebbes. He was a Vishnitzer Rebbe who lived until 1936. And that's a part of Hungary. And one day, he was a very respected man. And one day he walks in, which was uncharacteristic from him, in a big bank. And the head of that, the division of the bank, was a Jewish person in town. So when he saw the Rebbe, he had respect for him. But the Rebbe sat down in the chair and didn't say a word. 5 minutes pass, 10 minutes pass, a half hour passes. And finally he says, "You were here for a reason." And he says, "Yeah, I'm here for a reason. My reason is not to say anything." So he says, "Why are you not going to say anything?" He says, "Because," he quoted this Gemara. So he says, "Come on, you think that low of me that I can't receive it, I can't accept it?" It's not low, but it's a challenge. So after an hour or two, the man was begging him to say, so he said, "I'll tell you, against my principle." He says, "There's an elderly Jewish woman who's being evicted by your bank because she couldn't pay the mortgage, and she doesn't have the money to pay. Not a huge amount, but for her, it's too big." So he right away said, "Rebbe, it's not my bank. I'm only a manager in the bank." Says, "You see, I knew not to say open my mouth." So the man, and the Rebbe walked out. Well, the man went to look to see through the records who it was, and he was a man of means. So he went immediately and he paid off the whole mortgage because he took it to heart. So sometimes by not saying something, the Rebbe didn't want to criticize him and storm into the bank and say, "How dare in your bank you have someone that is suffering." And you give a look at criticism in general. Today, it's a kind of world that everybody has to express themselves. They go with signs and they scream in the streets and they make a whole big fuss. It doesn't affect change whatsoever because that's not the way to do it. So that is the idea of love. Now we're going to speak about guiding with gentleness. This is a very interesting case. Let me just give you a little bit of the background and then we'll read the story. In the olden days, going back 300 years ago, a lot of Jews could not afford living in the city. So many of them were what we call the Pale of Settlement. They lived in the country, they lived in rural areas. So you didn't have large Jewish communities. It actually was true even here in North Carolina, because I did a lot of study and I actually had documents in Yiddish that I had to translate. But people that came here at the turn of the previous century didn't always move to the big city. If they were tailors or they had other professions, they would move to small towns in North Carolina. One particular town was Carthage, North Carolina, where there were 3 Jewish families. Then there was Aiken, South Carolina. Have tons of stories to tell you about how they lived, but only for the high holidays would they go to the synagogue so that they can be there. So this was true in old Europe as well. Problem was that when you don't live in a community, sometimes you follow the path of your neighbors who are not exactly righteous. And there were a lot of people that, even though on the surface they sound like real countrymen and all of that, but the laws of modesty didn't exist. And a lot of times there was cheating husbands on wives and wives and husbands, as we now know. And there was also other kinds of stuff that happened. And this was a common problem. I would say 3% of the Jews that lived in these towns. 97% of the people were great. But there were 3% that weren't. And there were 2 students who were Rebbes in their own right of the Maggid of Mezrich, very holy men. One was Rabbi Elimelech of Lizensk, because he was the chief rabbi of Lizensk. The other one wasn't a chief rabbi, he was a teacher, but he was in the town of Anipoli. Anipoli is like Annapolis, because there was all kind of Annapolises, there was a Roman name. Like in Israel, you have the city of Shechem, that is called Nablus because the Romans called it Annapolis and the Arabs cannot pronounce a P, so they called it Nablus. But Annapolis was a very famous name. So Reb Zusha lived in Annapolis. Now, these two brothers were very well known. They were very holy people, and they loved humanity. There are tons of stories about them written up in Hasidic tales, in the authentic ones. But here's one of the things that they used to do. If they knew that in a particular town there was a yeshuvnik means a Jewish farmer, who on the surface was good, but they found out from the wife or others that there were problems there. So they wanted to set him straight. But instead of going to them and saying, as it was the custom by many preachers, you are a lowlife and you better fix yourself up, they had a different way they did it. Let's give a look in text 9. The saintly brothers, Rabbi Elimelech of Lizensk and Rabbi Zusha of Anipoli, were known to frequent the numerous outlying villages in which very few Jews lived, typically 2 or 3 lonely Jewish families per village. Back in those days, these Jewish households usually earned their living through peddling food and alcohol to local peasant populations. The overwhelming majority of these Jews were simple and uneducated. Many were pure-hearted and God-fearing individuals, but due to the abysmal moral standards in their local environments, some of these Jews adopted the ways that were less desirable. The Maggid of Mizrich, he was the successor to the Baal Shem Tov, would dispatch the saintly brothers to these villages so they can encourage and strengthen their fellow Jews in their Torah observance and awe of heaven, and of course, to straighten out their lives. The brothers chose a unique method of operation. Let's talk about this before we go on. One of them would behave as if he was a student, and the other one would behave as if he was his teacher. And the student would come and say, I need to have a tikkun. I need to be corrected in my ways. And in order to do that, I will spell out to you what my faults are. So he didn't do it out in the open. They would do it in a room next to where this farmer was, but loud enough that he should be able to hear, as if they are actually doing it for real when they were just really role-playing. Reb Zusha would deliberately address his brother loud enough for the nearby Jewish villager, the true target of their effort, to overhear their conversation. He would lament to his brother that he had failed in several ways, describing precisely the matters in which he noticed his Jewish visitor was failing. He knew what the visitor was doing. So he said, on this and this night, I did such a terrible thing, I cheated, or on this and this night, I wasn't honest, or in this, whatever he was saying, and he was saying it with tears, and he was crying. And then he would wait for Rabbi Elimelech to give him the way of correcting it. Overhearing the conversation, the villager would be struck with powerful pangs of regret, telling himself, didn't I do all the same things? The villager would continue listening eagerly as Rabbi Elimelech proceeded to inform Rabbi Zusha of the methods through which the latter was able to rectify these particular transgressions. The eavesdropping villager would take Rabbi Elimelech's words to heart and return to the proper path. So when you think about it, there was never an actual face-to-face confrontation. There was never an actual accusation. There was a role-playing without embarrassing the person. That's called sensitivity. Now, most of us can't do that. We're not going to go role-play that one of us is a student, the other one is a teacher, and then we're going to know exactly what the person did. But the reason to mention this and to study this is to understand the benefits of when you do it by love and when you do it with sensitivity and in a gentle, respectful way, how it could actually affect. Because remember, when you just come to someone and you say criticism, even though it's constructive criticism, they become defensive. And when they become defensive, they put up a shield, and with the shield, they fire back. But when they're coming with a gentle way, then it's being received. So even though we can't actually do it in that way, but nevertheless, we can learn from that. And let's give a look. One of the books from the time right after Maimonides is called Orchos Tzadikim, and he collected from many of the great rabbis, and he wrote it out, and it's text 10 on page 210. And he says the following: criticism should be conveyed gently and in private. Use soft speech and plead with your intended audience to realize that you have their good in mind. If you do this, you will be free of blame. By contrast, if you rebuke them in an angry voice and with rage, and you thereby shame them, then you are blameworthy, and your audience will not accept your words. Such is human nature. If someone is approached forcefully and they will counter with then they will counter with forcefulness of their own and refuse to concede. King Solomon, the wise, therefore said, softly spoken words of the wise are heard. So this is a very powerful statement. It's how the tone of voice that we use when we say the criticism, that it comes across that we really care about you and we really want your help and we trust you that you can actually do it. And that is a sensitive way. And not only that, as the next reading says, even if you say that you've done something wrong, you say you might have done something wrong. It might be misinterpreted, your action, that it's not sensitive. Give a look in what the Chidas says. The Chidas says, page 211, text 11, do not magnify the wrong by informing the individual you seek to redirect. You committed a really big sin. Your guilt is truly heavy. Those words will weigh heavily upon the recipient, prompting them to lash out against you in response. Instead, address them with love. Tell them, my friend, it seems to me that really, the way he says it in Hebrew, that you might have made a mistake. Use this kind of gentle phraseology and soft language so that your message will be accepted. Let's say if you heard somebody say something negative to another person, later when you have a chance, say, it may be that that person might have been offended, I don't know. And I know you meant well, but perhaps you analyze the words that you've said and see how you can correct it. And that was the way of Rabbi Elimelech and Rab Zusha. So that's the way of doing it. Love, and then we say gentle. Now we're going to go to humility. Humility is actually also a very interesting guidance. So before we go on, let me just explain something from the book of Chronicles in the Torah, in the Bible. In Hebrew, it's called Divrei Hayamim, and there's two sets, Divrei Hayamim Aleph, Divrei Hayamim Bet. Divrei Hayamim is two books in the Tanakh that they go and summarize a lot of the history of the Jewish people from when they came into Israel till the time of the destruction of the first temple. Now, it's not a repeat of everything that was written before, but it's written in a different language in a summary. And a lot of things that we don't find in the book of Jeremiah or Isaiah or Kings or Samuel are actually expressed in the Divrei Hayamim. Now, during the first temple period, there was a malady that afflicted the Jewish people, and that was idol worship. We learned that before in previous lessons, that one of the great sages in the Talmud had a dream that Menashe the king appeared to him, and he asked him, why is it that you worship idols? It's such a ridiculous thing. Who believes in idols? And he said to him, if you were in our day, you would pick up the hem of your pants so you could run quicker to go worship the idols. That was the malady. So the prophets of that time had a mission that they had to steer the people away from idol worship and to bring them back to the way. And that was what a lot of the prophets were doing, talking to the people and saying, amend your ways. It was Jeremiah. Jeremiah actually predicted that there's going to be destruction. He came after Isaiah. So that's why Jeremiah is called the prophet of doom, but he wasn't of doom. He was telling them the truth. And Isaiah was telling them the positive. But there was a very famous prophet called Zechariah. Now, there were several Zechariahs. There were lots of Zechariahs in the Bible. So we shouldn't confuse one with the other. This is Zechariah ben Yehoiada that we're going to talk about, that he was a prophet, and he also admonished the people, but he also came from very great lineage. He was also a Kohen. He was the son-in-law of a king. He was a prophet. He was a judge. And then before him, the Chronicles talks about another prophet. His name was Yahaziel. And his father's name was Zechariah, not the connection of this Zechariah, his Zechariah as well. And he actually was able to lift the spirits of the people. So let's give a look The Medrash says, why was it that Zechariah could not lift the people? And not only that, the people rebelled against him and they killed him. Whereas Yachziel, everybody listened to. So let's see what the Medrash says. The Medrash Kohelet Rabbah says the following. The Spirit of God enveloped Zechariah, the son of Yehoiada, the priest, as he stood above the people. That's the way the pasuk said. So when it says the Spirit of God enveloped him, what does the Spirit of God envelop? It means that he was filled with prophecy. Now, prophecy is not a simple subject. Prophecy, not everybody can claim prophecy. The Rambam writes that in order for someone to be a prophet, they had to be a tremendous Torah scholar. They had to be subservient to God. They couldn't bear hatred towards another person. They had to be totally transparent. They had to be totally refined. And even then, it was not guaranteed that they were going to be a prophet. So a prophet was on a high level. Now, sometimes a prophet can mess up later, once they became a prophet. But to become a prophet, it's not simple. And when the prophecy happens, there is the wisdom of God that envelops them. So when the wisdom of God envelops them, that's when they prophesizes. So what happened? He began to prophesize. They tied him up and they stoned him by order of the king, as we will soon see. So why was that? So look at the pasuk before. The pasuk said, and he stood above the people. Literally stood above the people means that he stood at a podium. He stood at a high stage so everybody can see him. The Medrash interprets that he stood above the people means that he was pompous. He saw himself better and greater than the people. He was much higher than them. Did he literally walk above the heads of the people? Rather, the phrase indicates that he considered himself greater than all the people. After all, he was the king's son-in-law, a priest, a prophet, and a judge. And therefore he began to speak arrogantly and told them, why do you transgress God's commandments? It will not succeed. And at the end, everybody turned against him. Immediately they conspired against him, stoned him to death by the king's command. Okay. Yahaziel, by contrast, because this is mentioned verses before, 4 chapters before that, he actually inspired the people. He did not behave himself. Rather, it's reported that the Spirit of God was upon Yahaziel, but it says betoch hakahal. The Hebrew betoch hakahal means amidst the assembly, not above the assembly, but amidst the assembly. What does amidst the assembly imply? He considered himself an equal of the assembly. Zechariah considered himself to be superior, therefore his admonition did not take. Yahaziel, he considered himself as one of the others. He was equal to everyone else. So what does this mean? It means that we have to be humble. Only a humble person can truly admonish another person. But if they're not humble, they can't do it. How does this work? There's very interesting play on words. Let's see what it says. In Leviticus, this is page 215, 13a. In Leviticus, if we look at the literal translation of the verse that we quoted before, do not hate your brother in your heart. Reprove, you shall reprove your fellow. In this part we didn't see. And do not bear a sin upon him. What does it mean, do not bear a sin upon him? Don't see him as a sinner. See him as an equal to you. See him as a godly soul who might have a stain, and we're here to help to wash off the stain. Don't look down at him. This is very much important. But then there's another thing. If you look at the Hebrew, it doesn't just say hocheach et amitecha, admonish your friend, but it says it twice. Hocheach tochiach. Admonish, you shall admonish. So why does it say twice? Many commentaries explain that it means that you definitely have to do it. You can't just put your eyes away. But the Baal Shem Tov had a different interpretation. And that is that you first have to admonish yourself before you admonish someone else. That's why there's the double admonishment. His student, Rabbi Yaakov Yosef of Polonia, who was a very famous scholar, writes this in text 13b. We must truly include ourselves in the words of critique we supply to others. The Torah therefore directs us, if we translate the verse literally, reprove, you shall reprove your fellow. Reprove yourself when you shall reprove your neighbor. Indeed, the Torah further clarifies, do not bear a sin upon him. Do not consider that his sin, the sin he committed, is only upon his shoulders and not upon yours as well. So before you prove someone else, reprove yourself. I have a fantastic story in a minute about this, but let's first see. Let me tell you the story, and then we'll read what the Baal Shem Tov says. Today was the yahrzeit of the Mittler Rebbe, the second Chabad Rebbe. And tonight is the day of his liberation, a year before he passed away. I just want to spend 1 minute to tell you about the Mittler Rebbe so we'll understand the story. The Mittler Rebbe was a spiritualist on the highest level. There was he was very skinny. The physical body had no meaning to him whatsoever. Nobody knew how he even survived. He ate very little, slept very little, but he had a passion and a knowledge that was beyond. His level of understanding and teaching, the teachings of Hasidus, was beyond anything in any generation. He can call together a group and give a discourse for 3 hours straight, then take a 10-minute break and go 3 hours further deeper. It's the deepest Kabbalah. When I was growing up, my father said, that's the Mittler Rebbe's Chassidus. Nobody knows it except some of the great scholars. It's unbelievable stuff. To him, the physical didn't mean anything. He was so spiritual that he only saw the spiritual in other people. He never saw the negative. He saw the positive in every person. So there was one time that he was traveling to another city in Russia because he was very famous in Russia and people wanted to see him and he had a private audience for them. So he comes to the city and he starts accepting people. All of a sudden, he calls in his aide who was arranging all the audiences and says, stop it. I'm taking a break. I cannot see anyone else. I will let you know when. He locks the door. For hours and hours and hours, he's by himself. And everybody's getting worried. They look through the keyhole. Remember, those days keyholes were open. And they see him on the floor weeping and reciting the Tachanun prayer, the confessional prayer, and pleading with God to forgive him. After he finished, he asked for some tea, and then he says, I can start seeing people. When the whole thing was over, it took a few days with interruptions. So the elders asked him, what happened? So he says, when someone comes into me and tells me about their problem, what right do I have to give them counsel? So I first have to search within myself the problem within me and how will I help them? Most people that come to me ask me for ways to correct their spiritual life. And they talk about sins that they have done, not as a confession, but saying, I have this terrible habit or I've failed in this sin. I need you to help me with it. And I usually help them. Says the other day, someone came in and said something so horrendous that I could not imagine that a person could do such a sin. So I couldn't find it within myself. So I asked myself, why did God send me someone with such a terrible sin? It must be that I have something of that sin within me that I don't even know. And therefore God sent me that person to say, look in the mirror because you have it and you haven't corrected yourself. And therefore I had to do tshuva. I had to see where was it within me that I might have a little bit of that and I have to correct myself. So instead of seeing the other person as a lowlife and how dare he come into me and bring such terrible things, he turned it around and he said, it's me. Otherwise, God wouldn't have sent him to me. And once he felt what it was, which to us it would have probably been nothing, but nevertheless to him it was something very big, and he was able to repent for that and correct himself and resolve, then he was ready to see people. And that's the meaning of the next reading. It is taken from the Baal Shem Tov. Text 14, page 216. Seeing a fault in another is like gazing into a mirror. If our face is dirty, we observe a dirty face. If our face is clean, we observe a clean face. As we are, so we see. This is not just as a plain statement. We believe that everything that happens in the world is for a reason. Everything is by divine providence. So if there's something that comes across our way, it's not by accident. It's there to teach us something. So everything that, no, there's certain things we shouldn't look at. There's certain things we shouldn't gaze at. But if it came across to us, it's there to teach us something, and everybody could learn their own lesson. So this is the idea of having humility. So we definitely are not at the level of the Mittler Rebbe. At least I'm not at the level of the Mittler Rebbe. Maybe you guys are, or some of you are. But I will say that it's definitely a guiding light that when you are humble about yourself and you're admonishing someone else, think to yourself, maybe I'm not so perfect as well. If you're going to accuse someone of theft, ask yourself, how many times did I take paper clips from the office? Now, what is a paper clip? You know, there's the old story of the child that was hungry and the evil inclination was saying, you're passing by a fruit store, take an apple. He has so many apples. He's never going to sell all the apples. And he's probably going to have to throw it out. And the good inclination comes and says, but it's theft. And the bad inclination says, theft, schmeth. He'll be thankful that someone is eating it. And finally, the child says, you know what? I'm not going to give in to my evil inclination. And as he walks away hungry, the storekeeper comes out and says, hi, you want to have an apple? Here's an apple. So he gave him a gift. But the point of the matter is that there's a consciousness that we have to recognize that sometimes we bend the law a little bit for our benefit. And it may not be gross or major things, but if we recognize that within ourselves, then we first cleanse ourselves, and with humility, we cleanse the others. Okay. In this is another part. When we reprove and when we admonish someone, how do we do that? So first of all, we have to know that they're ready. Besides our self-refinement, we need to know who they are and how they are. So here's a very interesting thing. Sometimes when we criticize someone, we label them. If somebody is not careful and they're taking tea and coffee and they spill it all over the place, so we'll say, you know, you're such a klutz. Now, if I spill the tea and I say, I'm such a klutz, that's fine, because I'm a klutz, that's fine. But if I say it to you, you're such a klutz, now I've labeled you as a klutz. So what are your expectations of yourself? By the way, the word klutz, I have to say, in our upbringing, klutz means a stud of wood. The stud of wood meant someone that has no knowledge, no brains. They may be handsome, they may be strong, but there's nothing more than a stud of wood. So when you said that klutz, it didn't necessarily mean a negative. Somehow klutz later became the same as a shlumiel. Now, what's a shlumiel? You ever heard the word shlumazel? What's a shlumazel and what's a shlumiel? A shlumiel is someone that's a klutz. A shlumazel is someone that's exposed to the bad luck. So, for instance, if a shlumiel is climbing up a ladder with a can of paint and he bumps into the side of the thing and the paint falls on the guy below, the guy above is the shlumiel, the guy below is the shlumazel, right? But if we say, you're such a shlumiel, what are we doing? We are actually labeling the person, and if we have an effect on them, if they are serious, they'll say, okay, what do you expect from me? If we say to someone, you know, you're so stupid that you're even thinking that way, we're basically labeling them as someone that cannot have the ability to think. And that is very wrong. So give a look at the way it says. There's a verse in Proverbs which says, do not reprove scoffers, for they will hate you. Reprove the wise, and they will love you. Now, on the surface, what does it mean? If you have a guy, a person that by nature, he does mockery, he's a mocker. We find throughout the Tanakh that one of the things that the sages and the prophets had to deal with was with the late Sonim. Late Sonim means the people that mocked. The mocked were the doubters, the sarcastic people. They couldn't believe anything. We find it in the Torah portion not a few weeks ago that when it says these are the offsprings of Yitzchak, the son of Abraham, Abraham bore Yitzchak. So the commentaries ask, why does it repeat itself? Once it says, this is the offspring of Yitzchak, the son of Abraham, you knew that he was the son of Abraham. So the commentaries explain that because Sarah didn't have children for such a long time, and she was kidnapped by Avimelech, and after that she became pregnant, certainly the child wasn't Abraham's because he's proven for so many years that he can't have children. The child is the son of Avimelech. In those days, you didn't have the ability to do DNA tests. So the mockers were saying that. So what did God do? God, in his infinite wisdom, helped the genetics work in such a way that the image of the face of Yitzchak was a copy of the face of his father. So nobody can doubt that he was Avram's son. So that's why the Torah repeats it, that Avram bore Yitzchak to say he looked like him in order to prove to everybody. But it means that the Torah had to write down those words because the mockers and the sarcastic people had a tremendous influence. So therefore, even in Proverbs, you find that Shlomo HaMelech, King Solomon, is giving you advice. Don't reprove the scoffers. They're going to hate you anyway. So why do you even go to them? But if you need to reprove, go to the wise people because they truly want to correct their ways. Comes along the Shalah. The Shalah was a great rabbi that lived many years later. And again, there's a whole story about him as well. He was a great author, a great wise person. So he says the following: if you wish to author criticism, do not tell the person how awful they are. If you do, they will despise you and not heed your words. This is the meaning of the verse, do not reprove scoffers, meaning do not reprove them by diminishing them or labeling them as scoffers. Give them a label and say, you're no good Nick anyways. You're a mocker, so why should I even talk to you? To the contrary, explain to them how unbefitting it is for the wise person like them to behave in such a manner. Just like we said before, it's unfitting for you because he's such a smart person. This is the implication of the phrase, reprove the wise, meaning consider them as wise, and then they will heed your words and accept the critique. So what is the meaning of this? The meaning of this is appeal to the individual's inherent goodness. See what they are. Guide with positivity. See their positive aspects and build on it. Now, there's one final reading that we have, which actually is very interesting because it's a bit problematic, but let's read it for what it is. We read from the same author before, Rabbi Yosef Chaim David Azuli is known as the Chida. Do not offer critique with an unequivocal reprimand, informing others that their actions are so bad that you're compelled to criticize them. If you do so, they will despise you. Rather, deliver your message couched in your personal opinion. Tell them what you have done can be seen two ways. There are grounds to justify it, but also reasons to criticize it. In my opinion, it would be better for you to refrain from this kind of thing because not everyone knows your good nature like I do. If you formulate your message like this, your audience will certainly like you. They will appreciate the dignity you provided them by couching a critique as your personal opinion rather than delivering an unequivocal reprimand. This is, again, being sensitive to the person and saying, you know what, it might be what you did was right, but could be others would interpret it as wrong. In my opinion, I don't know if it's going to be the best. You're saying it in a soft tone. You're saying it with love. You're saying it with respect. You're saying it with a positivity because you have faith in the person. And you're saying it in such a way that it gives the person some food for thought so they can reflect on it. And then they can say, you know, maybe I'm wrong. And maybe I should redo it. Now, we've talked all about how to deliver critique, but we didn't talk about how to receive critique. And at the end of the day, next week, we're going to learn about forgiveness. But what I want to talk about now, what happens, and this is not in the text, what happens if we're the recipient of very powerful critique and someone criticizes us and says things that make us uncomfortable? We can learn from this as well. The Mishnah says that the true wise accept shame, but they don't give it back. In other words, the very righteous, when they receive criticism like that, will say, you know what, perhaps I offended somebody else, and God wants to forgive me and gave me the opportunity to be the recipient of this kind of criticism where the person really made me feel miserable. And hopefully it teaches me how to be sensitive. And from now on, I'm not going to do it. But rather than jump back at the person, we accept it. That's one thing. Another thing is, even if you don't accept it, but internalize it. And internalize it and use it as a teachable moment for yourself. And when you use it as a teachable moment for yourself, then it helps us knowing how to criticize others. So we always have to put ourselves in the recipient's place rather than in the giver's place. And this is something that we have to constantly do. And it's a tough job, but it's very, very doable. And when we do that, it's much easier and life is simpler and there's more of a cohesiveness. So we're still doing what we need to do. We need to help the other person change, but we're doing it in a way that saves their dignity, that it appeals to them, and that they appreciate it. And they will say, thank you, I really didn't think of it. And it actually cements the relationship in a very positive way. But sometimes somebody hurts us so bad that we walk with the pain for a long time. And then we have to know how to forgive. And that's what we will talk about in the following week, which is called the art of forgiveness. No questions, comments? Thank you very much for listening.
Quick announcement, Hanukkah is coming up, and there's 2 free programs offered to the community.
Master the book.
One is on Wednesday, December 25th at Symphony Park, right outside South Park Mall. It's a Hanukkah festival for families. And one is a Simply Spot concert by 3 Hasidic Breslov